The Burnt Indigo House of Madhupur, a true horror story. About 15 years ago, deep inside the forests of Madhupur in Tangle, there was an old forest rest house surrounded by endless trees and silence. During the day, the forest looked beautiful and peaceful. But after sunset, the place felt completely different. My cousin Mahir told me this story. Back in 2007, Mahir was studying in the final year of his master's program at Dhaka University. After finishing their exams, he and three of his close friends decided to go on a memorable trip before starting their professional lives. The four friends were Mahir, Sajid, Rifat, and Anik. One of their relatives worked in the forest department, which helped them get permission to stay in a forest rest house located deep inside the Madhupur Gar. It was the middle of November. Winter had not fully arrived yet, but the evening air carried a slight chill. When they left Tangle town and entered the forest area by a small vehicle, the sun was already setting. On both sides of the road stood tall sal and gazari trees. The red soil road ran through the dense jungle like a narrow path. By the time they reached the rest house, darkness had completely taken over. The building was an old one-story structure. The white walls were covered with patches of moss. In front of the house stood a large well, and beside it, an enormous tamarind tree. The twisted branches of that tree looked almost like skeletal arms reaching into the night sky. The caretaker of the rest house was an elderly man named Hazmat Mia. He quietly showed them their rooms. There were two large rooms, each with two beds. The friends decided to stay together in the same room. The first night went quite well. They sat on the veranda for hours, talking, singing, and enjoying the peaceful forest atmosphere. Hazmat Mia even cooked a delicious country chicken meal for them. But before leaving for the night, the caretaker said something strange. He told them calmly, "Boys, after midnight don't stay outside. And make sure your windows are tightly closed." The friends did not take it seriously. They simply thought it was the usual superstition people from rural areas often believe. The next afternoon, they decided to explore the forest. Before they left, Hazmat Mia warned them not to go too deep into the jungle. But curiosity and adventure were stronger than caution. After walking for almost an hour, they reached a strange place inside the forest. It looked like the ruins of an old building. Broken walls, scattered bricks, and silence everywhere. No birds. No wind. Just a strange stillness. Then Sajid noticed something unusual. Near a pile of old bricks was a small mound of earth. On top of the mound stood a bamboo stick wrapped with a piece of red cloth. It looked similar to the kind of marker often seen near shrines or spiritual sites in villages. Sajid laughed and said jokingly, "Is someone buried here? Some holy man maybe." Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed the bamboo stick and shook it lightly. Mahir immediately told him to stop. But the damage had already been done. That evening, on their way back to the rest house, Sajid became unusually quiet. Normally, he was the most energetic and talkative among them. But now he walked silently behind the others, staring at the ground. When they returned, Sajid said he wanted to wash up at the well. He took a bucket and went outside. But after 20 minutes, he still hadn't returned. Mahir and Anik went to check on him. What they saw made their blood run cold. Sajid was standing beside the well, staring at the tamarind tree. The bucket of water beside him was untouched. When Mahir called his name, Sajid slowly whispered, "They are calling me." "Who?" Mahir asked. Sajid replied without turning his head. "The woman in the red sari, sitting on the tree branch." Mahir immediately shined a flashlight toward the tree. There was nothing there. Only dry branches moving gently in the wind. That night, things became even stranger. Around midnight, Mahir suddenly woke up. He heard a scratching sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It sounded like someone dragging their nails across the wall. When he looked toward Sajid's bed, he froze in terror. Sajid was sitting on the bed, but not like a normal person. He was crouched on all fours like an animal. His fingers were scratching the wall while making a strange growling sound. Mahir quickly woke Rifat and Anik. When they shined the flashlight at Sajid, he slowly turned his head. His eyes were completely red. And then he smiled. But it was not Sajid's smile. It was something else. Something darker. In a low, distorted voice he said, "Why did you come here? This place belongs to me." Just then, the caretaker Hazmat Mia rushed into the room with a lantern. The moment he saw Sajid's condition, his face turned pale. He whispered in fear, "The seal, it's broken." The friends were confused. "What seal?" Hazmat Mia then told them an old story. Long ago, during the British colonial period, a cruel indigo planter lived in a large house inside that forest. He was known for his extreme brutality toward local villagers. One day, the villagers rebelled and burned the entire house. The planter and his men died in that fire. But after that incident, strange things began to happen in the area. People who entered the ruins often became sick or mentally unstable. Eventually, a religious scholar was brought to the village. After performing spiritual rituals, he supposedly trapped an evil entity beneath the earth. The bamboo stick wrapped with red cloth was placed there as a seal. As long as that bamboo remained untouched, the entity would stay trapped underground. But if anyone disturbed it, the seal would weaken, and the thing beneath would wake again. When Mahir heard this, his heart sank. Because earlier that day, Sajid had shaken that bamboo. That night inside the forest rest house became the longest night of their lives. And even today, Mahir says that whenever he remembers that night, he still feels the cold breath of the Madhupur forest. Because some places never truly forget. The Locked Room in the Village House, a true horror story. This story was shared by a man named Arif. It happened about 7 years ago in a small village in the Jhenata district of Bangladesh. At that time, Arif and his family were living abroad. They only visited Bangladesh once or twice a year during special occasions. One year, they received an invitation to attend a cousin's wedding in their village. After many years away from the countryside, the entire family was excited. The peaceful village roads, the open fields, and the quiet nights were very different from the busy cities they were used to. But none of them knew that this visit would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of their lives. Because of the wedding, many guests had arrived in the village, so the relatives arranged a separate old house for Arif's family to stay in. The house was located a little away from the main road. When they first arrived in the evening, the place already felt strange. The building looked very old. It had several rooms connected by a long corridor, wooden doors, and faded walls that seemed untouched for years. But there was one room that immediately caught everyone's attention. At the far end of the corridor, there was a door that was tightly locked from the outside. The man who owned the house quickly said, "That room is just a storage room. You don't need to open it." Since everyone was tired from traveling, they didn't think much about it. They cleaned a few rooms and settled down for the night. Arif and his younger brother stayed in one room. His parents stayed in another room, and his 2 sisters stayed in a third room. Everything seemed normal at first. But that night, something strange happened. Around midnight, Arif suddenly woke up. He wasn't sure why, but the room suddenly felt colder. Much colder than it should have been. Then he heard something. Footsteps. Bare footsteps. Slowly walking in the corridor. At first, he thought someone from the family might be awake. But the sound was coming from only one direction. The locked room. He clearly heard the wooden door of the locked room open slowly. Creak. Creak. Then the footsteps came out. Soft. Slow. And they stopped right in front of his room. Arif froze. His heart started beating faster. He called out quietly, "Is someone there?" No answer. A few seconds later, the latch of his door slowly opened by itself. The door moved slightly, and through the small gap, Arif saw something that made his entire body go cold. A shadow. A tall human-shaped shadow standing outside the door. But the strange thing was, no one was actually there. Only the shadow. The lantern light in the room flickered slightly, and the temperature suddenly dropped again. Then Arif heard a whisper near his ear. A cold, slow whisper. "You are in my house. If you stay here, you must follow my rules." Arif immediately started reciting Ayatul Kursi under his breath. After a few seconds, the shadow disappeared, and the room slowly returned to normal. Arif wasn't sure if it was a dream or not. The next morning, he told his mother about it. She simply said he was probably tired from traveling. But the next night, something even stranger happened. Arif's young cousins were playing in the hallway. Suddenly, both of them stopped and stared at the locked room. Then they started crying. When the adults asked what happened, the children said something that shocked everyone. They said, "A lady is standing there. She's wearing black clothes and calling us inside." But when the adults looked at the door, there was no one there. They assumed the children were imagining things. That night, everyone went to sleep again. But around 1 a.m., the entire house suddenly filled with screams. Everyone woke up at the same time. Arif's sisters were screaming. His parents rushed out of their room. His aunt was crying near the bathroom. Everyone thought the others were screaming first. But no one knew who actually started it. Then Arif's aunt finally explained what she saw. She had gone to the bathroom. While she was inside, she heard the locked room door open slowly. Then she heard footsteps walking toward the children's room. A few seconds later, the children started screaming. That same night, Arif noticed something else. Outside the locked room, there were faint footprints on the floor. The footprints looked like they belonged to someone wearing alta, the red dye traditionally worn on feet. It looked exactly like a woman had walked barefoot across the corridor. But no one in the house had done that. The next night, the family decided to stay together in one room. But around 3 a.m., Arif saw the shadow again. This time it was clearer. A tall figure wrapped in black cloth slowly entered the room. It leaned toward his father and whispered something. Then it vanished. A few seconds later, loud laughter echoed from inside the locked room. A woman's laughter. That was the moment everyone realized something was seriously wrong. The next morning, they confronted the owner of the house. At first, he denied everything. But eventually, he confessed the truth. The house once belonged to a family who practiced dark rituals many years ago. After they left the village, strange things started happening in that locked room. People who stayed in the house reported seeing a woman dressed in black wandering through the corridors at night. One man was even found dead inside that locked room, even though the door had been locked from the outside. After hearing this, Arif's family immediately left the house. They spent the rest of the wedding staying with other relatives. And no one from the family ever returned to that house again. Even today, villagers say the locked room still exists. And sometimes late at night, people claim they hear footsteps walking through the empty corridor. The Midnight Call from the Graveyard, a true horror story. This story happened in a small village in northern Bangladesh. It was shared by a man named Anik, who experienced something strange when he was just a child. At that time, Anik was around 7 years old. The village where he lived was quiet and simple. Most houses were surrounded by open fields, ponds, and narrow dirt roads. Life there was peaceful, especially during the holy month of Ramadan. Every evening after breaking the fast, people would gather in the mosque for prayer. One night, just like every other day, Anik finished his iftar and prepared to go to the mosque. The mosque was only a short walk from his house. But the road had a strange shape. If you looked at it from above, it looked like the letter L. At the corner of the road stood the village mosque. But behind that corner, on a small raised area, there was an old graveyard. Most villagers avoided that place at night. But Anik was just a child, and children rarely think about such things. He went to the mosque, prayed with everyone, and then started walking back home. By the time the prayer ended, the village was completely dark. There were no street lights, only the faint glow of a few house lamps in the distance. As Anik reached the corner of the road near the graveyard, something strange happened. He heard a sound, a soft call, almost like someone whispering his name. At first he thought it might be someone he knew. So he turned his head and looked toward the graveyard. And what he saw made his heart stop. On top of one of the graves, someone was sitting. The figure looked like an old man. He was crouched down in an unusual position. The figure was completely white. White clothes, white face, white hair, and it was sitting silently on top of the grave. The moment Anik saw it, a wave of fear rushed through his body. Without thinking, he screamed and ran toward his house as fast as he could. His scream was loud enough to wake people nearby. At the same time, a man from the village was passing by in an auto rickshaw. He heard the scream and immediately turned on his headlights toward the graveyard. When he looked carefully, he saw something sitting on the grave. But according to him, it was just a dog sitting quietly on the grave. The villagers assumed that Anik had simply been frightened by the dog in the darkness. After all, a child's imagination can easily turn shadows into something terrifying. But Anik knew what he saw. He was sure it wasn't a dog. The figure he saw looked exactly like a person. For the next week, Anik became very sick. He had a high fever and kept waking up at night, frightened and confused. His family eventually took him to a local religious scholar for help. After some prayers and spiritual guidance, he slowly recovered. Years later, Anik still remembers that night clearly. Even now, when he thinks about the graveyard, he feels the same cold fear he felt that night. Because sometimes, in quiet villages, not every shadow belongs to the living. The bus that never reached the village, a true horror story. This story was shared by a man named Raman. It happened in the winter of 2003, when he was returning to his village after finishing work in Dhaka. At that time, traveling from the city to remote villages took a long time. Roads were narrow, transportation was limited, and sometimes the last bus of the night was the only way to reach home. Raman boarded a late-night bus from Dhaka. The bus was heading toward the northern part of the country, passing through several small towns and rural highways. The journey started normally. Passengers were chatting quietly, some were sleeping, and the driver was focused on the dark highway ahead. Outside the windows, the night looked endless. Fields stretched far into the darkness, with only occasional lights from distant houses. After several hours of traveling, the bus reached a remote highway area surrounded by forest and open land. It was already past midnight. Most passengers were asleep. Suddenly, the bus slowed down. Raman looked outside the window. At the side of the road stood a woman dressed in white. She was standing completely still. Her long hair covered part of her face, and she seemed to be looking toward the bus. The driver stopped the vehicle. The bus helper opened the door and asked, "Where are you going at this hour?" The woman spoke softly. "I need to go to the next village." Her voice sounded calm, almost too calm for someone standing alone on an empty highway after midnight. Some passengers felt uncomfortable, but no one said anything. She stepped inside the bus and sat quietly in the back seat. For the next 15 minutes, everything was silent. Then something strange began to happen. The temperature inside the bus suddenly felt colder. Raman noticed that the passengers sitting near the woman had moved away from her. One man whispered to another, "Did you see her feet?" Raman turned around slowly. And then he noticed something disturbing. The woman's feet were not touching the floor. They were slightly above it. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the dim bus lights. But then the bus passed under a bright street lamp. For a brief second, the light filled the entire bus. And everyone saw it clearly. The woman's feet were reversed, completely backwards. A wave of panic spread through the passengers. One elderly man immediately started reciting prayers quietly. The driver, unaware of what was happening, continued driving. But suddenly, the woman stood up. She slowly walked toward the front of the bus. Every step felt unnatural. The bus became completely silent. When she reached the driver's seat, she spoke again. In a low voice, "You should not have stopped tonight." The driver looked confused. "What do you mean?" The woman smiled. But the smile looked strange, almost unnatural. Then the bus lights flickered once, twice, and suddenly the engine stopped. The bus came to a complete halt in the middle of the empty road. No one spoke. The driver tried restarting the engine. But nothing worked. Then, just as suddenly as everything started, the woman was gone. The door of the bus was still closed. No one had seen her leave. She simply disappeared. A few minutes later, the engine started again by itself. The driver quickly drove away from that road without stopping again. When Raman finally reached his village, he asked local people about that highway. One elderly villager told him something unsettling. Years ago, a woman had died in a tragic accident on that same road. People believed that on certain nights, she still waited there for passing vehicles. And sometimes, when someone stopped, she would ride along. The Night Guard of the Abandoned School, a true horror story. This story was shared by a man named Camel. It happened around 2010 in a small town school that had been closed for several years. The building once used to be a government primary school, but after a new school was built nearby, the old building was abandoned. Over time, the place became quiet and empty. The windows were broken. The walls were covered with moss, and the playground slowly turned into wild grass. Most people avoided the area after sunset. But one night, Camel had no choice but to spend the night there. At that time, Camel worked as a temporary security guard for different properties around the town. One evening, the owner of the land asked him to watch over the abandoned school building because construction workers had recently stored some materials there. Camel agreed. He arrived at the school just before sunset. The place looked even more unsettling than he expected. The old classroom stood silently in a row. A large banyan tree stood in the middle of the playground. Its long roots hung down like shadows in the fading light. As night slowly fell, the area became completely silent. Around 9 p.m., Camel sat on a wooden chair in one of the classrooms. He had a small lantern, a flashlight in his phone. For the first few hours, everything was normal. Occasionally he heard insects outside. Sometimes a dog barked somewhere far away. But around midnight, something strange happened. Camel heard footsteps, slow footsteps, coming from the corridor outside the classroom. At first, he thought it might be someone trying to enter the property. So he grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The corridor was empty. All the classroom doors were closed. There was no one there. He checked the entire building. Nothing. Assuming it was just his imagination, he returned to his chair. But about 15 minutes later, the footsteps returned. This time they were clearer. Step, 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 and they sounded exactly like someone walking slowly across the corridor. Camel quickly opened the door again. But once again, the corridor was empty. Now he felt uneasy. He closed the door and sat quietly, listening. Then something even stranger happened. From the classroom next door, he heard a sound. The sound of a wooden desk moving, slowly dragging across the floor. Camel immediately walked toward that classroom. He pushed the door open. The room was dark and dusty. Broken desks and chairs were scattered everywhere. But none of them were moving. Everything was perfectly still. He stood there for a few seconds. Then he noticed something that made him freeze. On the blackboard at the front of the room, there was writing. Fresh writing. White chalk marks. But when he had checked the room earlier that evening, the board had been completely empty. Now a sentence was written across it. "Why are you here?" Camel felt a cold chill run down his spine. He quickly wiped the writing off with his hand. Then he returned to his chair. But now he couldn't relax. The silence of the building felt heavier. Around 2 a.m., the lantern light began flickering. The air inside the classroom suddenly felt colder. Then Camel heard something behind him. A faint sound, like someone whispering. He slowly turned around and saw something that he would never forget. At the far end of the classroom, near the blackboard, a small figure was standing. It looked like a child. The figure was wearing what looked like an old school uniform, but the face was hidden in shadow. Camel tried to speak. "Who's there?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it slowly raised one hand and pointed toward the blackboard. Camel turned to look. The writing had returned. The same words. "Why are you here?" When Camel looked back at the figure, it was gone. Completely gone. The classroom was empty again. At that moment, Camel decided he would not stay inside the building anymore. He grabbed his flashlight and spent the rest of the night sitting outside near the school gate. When morning finally arrived, he left immediately. Later that day, he asked an elderly man from the town about the abandoned school. The man told him something unexpected. Many years ago, when the school was still open, a young student had died after collapsing during class. Some teachers believed the child had been extremely attached to the school. And even after the building was abandoned, some people claimed that on quiet nights, they could hear footsteps in the corridors. And sometimes, the sound of desks moving in empty classrooms. Camel never returned to that school again. But even today, whenever he passes by the old building, he avoids looking toward the windows. Because sometimes, he feels like someone inside is still watching. The Last Train at Platform 3, a true horror story. This story was shared by a railway worker named Hassan. It happened in 2008 at a small railway station in the northern part of Bangladesh. The station was old and quiet. Only a few trains stopped there during the day, and after midnight the entire place became almost completely empty. Hassan worked as a night shift signal operator. His job was simple. He had to monitor the tracks, control the signals, and report any unusual activity during the night. Most nights were peaceful. Too peaceful. The only sounds were insects, distant train horns, and sometimes the wind passing through the empty platform. One winter night, Hassan arrived at the station for his shift around 11 p.m. The station master had already gone home. The ticket counter was closed, and the small waiting room was empty. Only the yellow platform lights illuminated the long railway track, disappearing into the darkness. Around midnight, Hassan made his usual inspection round. Everything looked normal. The signal lights were working. The tracks were clear, and there were no passengers anywhere. But around 1:30 a.m. something strange happened. Hassan heard a sound. Footsteps. Soft footsteps walking across platform 3. At first he thought it might be a late passenger waiting for a train. So he stepped outside the signal room and looked toward the platform. There was a woman standing near the edge of the platform. She was wearing a white sari. Her long hair moved gently in the cold night wind. Hassan was surprised. No trains were scheduled for another 2 hours. He walked toward her slowly. "Excuse me," he said. "The next train will arrive after a long time." The woman didn't answer. She simply stood there, looking down at the railway tracks. Hassan felt slightly uncomfortable, but he assumed she might just be upset or lost. So he returned to his office. A few minutes later, the station phone rang. It was the railway control office. They were informing him that a freight train would pass through the station shortly without stopping. Hassan quickly stepped outside again to ensure the tracks were clear. And then he noticed something strange. The woman was still standing there, in exactly the same place, in exactly the same position. She hadn't moved at all. The sound of the approaching train horn echoed from far away. Hassan walked toward her again. This time his voice sounded more serious. "You need to step back from the edge. The train is coming." But the woman still didn't respond. Then slowly, she turned her head and looked directly at Hassan. For a brief moment, he could see her face clearly under the platform light. Her expression looked empty, almost emotionless. And then something impossible happened. Without making any sound, the woman slowly stepped forward and disappeared directly onto the railway track. Hassan ran forward in shock. But when he looked down at the track, there was no one there. The train roared past the station seconds later. The powerful wind from the train nearly pushed Hassan backward. When the train finally disappeared into the distance, the platform became silent again. The woman was gone. Completely gone. Hassan searched the entire station. He checked the tracks. He checked the waiting room. But there was no sign that anyone had ever been there. The next morning, Hassan told the station master about what happened. The old station master listened quietly. Then he sighed and said something Hassan would never forget. "Many years ago," he said, "a woman died on that track. She was waiting for someone who never arrived. Since then, some night workers say they still see her standing on platform 3. Hassan never saw the woman again. But after that night, whenever he worked the midnight shift, he avoided looking toward platform 3. Because sometimes, even when the platform looks empty, he still hears footsteps." The phone call from the empty apartment, a true horror story. This story was shared by a man named Farhan. It happened in 2016 when he moved to Dhaka for his first job after finishing university. Like many young professionals, Farhan rented a small apartment near his office. The building was not very new, but it was affordable and located in a quiet neighborhood. There were 6 floors in total. Farhan rented a one-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor. For the first few weeks, everything felt normal. He worked during the day and returned home late in the evening. Most of his neighbors kept to themselves, so the building was usually quiet. But there was one apartment that always caught his attention. The apartment directly across from his door. Apartment 4B. The strange thing was, no one seemed to live there. The lights were always off. The door was always locked. And Farhan had never seen anyone enter or leave. One evening, while he was talking to the building caretaker downstairs, he casually asked about it. The caretaker paused for a moment. Then he said, "That apartment has been empty for years." Farhan didn't ask any more questions. He assumed the owner simply didn't rent it out. But about 2 months later, something strange began happening. One night around 1 a.m., Farhan woke up suddenly. At first he thought it was just a random disturbance. But then he heard something. A phone ringing. It was coming from outside his door. The sound was clear. A mobile phone ringing repeatedly in the hallway. Farhan opened his door and looked outside. The corridor was empty. The ringing stopped. Thinking someone might have dropped their phone, he checked the floor. Nothing. Confused, he went back inside and returned to bed. The next night, the same thing happened. At exactly 1 a.m., the phone rang again in the hallway. This time Farhan opened the door immediately. Again, the corridor was empty. And again, the ringing stopped the moment he opened the door. Now he felt uneasy. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of apartment 4B. But that apartment had been empty for years. A few days passed. Then one night, the ringing started again. But this time it sounded different. Closer. Much closer. Almost like it was coming from inside the empty apartment. Farhan slowly stepped into the hallway. The sound was definitely coming from 4B. He walked toward the door. The ringing stopped. Then something unexpected happened. Farhan's own phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. The caller ID said, "Unknown number." He hesitated for a moment. Then he answered, "Hello." At first there was only silence. Then he heard something faint. Breathing. Slow, quiet breathing. And then, a whisper. "Why are you standing outside my door?" Farhan's heart started racing. He slowly turned his head toward the door of apartment 4B. And for a brief second, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The door was slightly open. Just a small gap. And inside the darkness, he thought he saw someone standing there, watching him. Farhan immediately stepped back. He ended the call and rushed back into his apartment. The next morning, he went downstairs and told the caretaker everything. The old man listened carefully. Then he said something Farhan never expected. Years ago, a woman had lived in apartment 4B. She had lived there alone. One night, neighbors reported hearing her phone ringing continuously. But when the caretaker checked the apartment, the door was locked from the inside, and the woman was found inside, lying on the floor. Her phone was still ringing beside her. After that incident, no one wanted to rent the apartment. The owner eventually locked it permanently. Farhan moved out of the building 2 weeks later. But even now, sometimes late at night, He still remembers that whisper on the phone and the half-open door of the empty apartment. Because sometimes, even empty places are not truly empty. The Voice from the Forest Road, a true horror story. This story was shared by a man named Imran. It happened in 2012 in a rural area not far from Tango. At that time, Imran was working in a small electronics shop in a nearby town. Every night after closing the shop, he had to travel back to his village using a narrow road that passed through a stretch of forest and farmland. During the day, the road looked normal. Farmers walked along it, children rode bicycles, sometimes small vans carried vegetables to the market. But at night, the road felt completely different. There were no streetlights, only the faint glow of the moon and the sound of insects in the surrounding fields. Imran usually returned home around 10 p.m. on his motorcycle. One night he closed the shop later than usual. By the time he started riding home, it was already close to midnight. The road was empty. No cars, no people, only darkness. As he rode along the forest road, the wind grew colder. The trees on both sides cast long shadows across the narrow path. About halfway through the forest, Imran noticed something unusual. Someone was standing beside the road. It was a woman. She was wearing a light-colored shawl and stood completely still under a tall tree. Imran slowed his motorcycle. It was unusual to see someone standing alone there at such a late hour. He stopped a few meters away and asked, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't answer. She simply stood there with her head slightly lowered. Imran assumed she might be lost or waiting for someone. So he asked again, "Where do you need to go? I can drop you at the village." For a few seconds there was silence. Then the woman slowly raised her head. Her face was difficult to see in the darkness, but her voice sounded calm. "Just a little further ahead." Imran hesitated for a moment. But the road ahead led directly toward his village anyway. So he agreed. The woman quietly sat on the back of the motorcycle. As Imran started driving again, something strange happened. The air suddenly felt colder. Much colder than before. Imran could clearly feel the cold behind him. Almost like the temperature around the passenger seat had dropped. They rode in silence for several minutes. Then Imran noticed something strange in the motorcycle mirror. The seat behind him looked empty. He quickly turned his head. The woman was still there, sitting quietly. But when he looked at the mirror again, there was still no reflection. Now Imran felt nervous. He increased the speed of the motorcycle slightly. Then the woman spoke again. "Slow down." Her voice sounded different now. Lower, almost echoing. Imran slowly reduced the speed. They were approaching the end of the forest road. In the distance, the lights of the village could finally be seen. Then suddenly the woman said, "Stop here." They were still several minutes away from the village. Imran looked around. There were no houses, no paths, just an old tree beside the road. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes." Imran stopped the motorcycle. The woman stepped off quietly. As she walked toward the tree, Imran noticed something strange about the ground beneath her feet. There were no footprints, even though the road was covered with soft dust. Then the woman stopped beside the tree. She slowly turned back toward him. And for a brief second, Imran could see her face clearly under the moonlight. Her expression was pale. Her eyes looked distant, almost empty. Then she said one final sentence. "Thank you for the ride." And before Imran could say anything, she simply faded into the darkness beside the tree. Not walked away, not ran away. just disappeared. Imran sat frozen on his motorcycle for several seconds. Then he started the engine and rode home as fast as he could. The next day, he told the story to an elderly man in the village. The old man listened quietly. Then he said something unsettling. Years ago, a young woman had died in an accident on that exact road. She had been walking home late at night when a vehicle struck her near that same tree. Some villagers believed that on certain nights, travelers might still meet her, standing silently beside the forest road, waiting for someone to give her one last ride home. The room on the sixth floor, a true horror story. This story was shared by a man named Nabil. It happened in 2018 when he moved to Chittagong for a new job. Like many young professionals, Nabil had to find a place to stay quickly. After searching for several days, he finally rented a room in an old 6-story apartment building. The rent was cheap, and the location was close to his office. At first, the place seemed normal. The building was quiet, most of the tenants were office workers, and the neighborhood felt safe. But there was something unusual about the 6th floor. Nabil lived on the 5th floor. Above him was the 6th floor, but strangely, nobody seemed to live there. The lights were always off. The hallway was always dark. And the elevator never stopped there. One evening, while talking with the building security guard, Nabil asked about it. The guard hesitated for a moment. Then he said, "People used to live there, but not anymore." Nabil didn't push the conversation further. He assumed the apartments upstairs were simply empty. For the next few weeks, everything went normally. Until one night. It was around 2 a.m. Nabil woke up suddenly. At first he thought it was just a random disturbance. But then he heard a sound. Footsteps. Slow footsteps. Walking directly above his ceiling. Step. 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 The sound moved across the floor of the 6th story. Nabil frowned. He knew nobody lived upstairs. So who was walking there? At first he tried to ignore it. But the footsteps continued. For almost 10 minutes. Finally, curiosity got the better of him. He decided to go upstairs and check. He took his phone flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The elevator doors were closed, so he used the staircase. As he climbed the stairs toward the 6th floor, the building felt strangely quiet. Even quieter than usual. When he reached the top, he noticed something odd. The door to the 6th floor corridor was slightly open. But according to the guard, that floor was supposed to stay locked. Nabil slowly pushed the door open. The corridor was dark and dusty. Most of the apartment doors were sealed with old tape and warning notices. Clearly, nobody had lived there for years. But the air felt cold. Colder than the rest of the building. Then he heard it again. Footsteps. This time right in front of him. Walking slowly across the corridor. But there was no one there. The sound moved toward the far end of the hallway. Nabil followed the sound carefully. Then suddenly, one of the apartment doors creaked open by itself. Apartment 6C. The door slowly swung inward. Nabil stood frozen. His flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. For a moment, the corridor was completely silent. Then something inside the apartment moved. A shadow passed across the wall. Nabil slowly stepped closer to the doorway. He shined the flashlight inside. The apartment looked empty. Broken furniture. Dust everywhere. But on the far wall, something strange caught his attention. There was writing on the wall. Large letters scratched into the paint. 3 words. Don't come here. Nabil felt a cold chill run through his body. Just then, he heard breathing. Slow breathing. coming from somewhere inside the room. He turned the flashlight toward the corner of the apartment, and for a brief moment, he saw a figure standing there. Tall, completely still, its face hidden in shadow. Nabil immediately stepped back. The flashlight flickered, and when the light stabilized again, the corner was empty. The figure was gone. At that moment, the apartment door slammed shut behind him. The loud bang echoed through the entire corridor. Panicking, Nabil ran toward the staircase and rushed down to the 5th floor. The next morning, he confronted the security guard. The old man looked worried. Then he finally told the truth. Years earlier, a man had lived on the 6th floor. Neighbors had complained about strange noises coming from his apartment at night. One day, the police were called. When they entered the apartment, they found the man dead inside, standing in the corner of the room. No clear cause. After that incident, several tenants reported hearing footsteps on the 6th floor late at night. Eventually, the building owner sealed the entire floor and stopped renting those apartments. Nabil moved out of the building within a week. But even today, whenever he thinks about that night, he still remembers the writing on the wall. "Don't come here." The passenger in the last ride, a true horror story. This story was shared by a rideshare driver named Saif. It happened in 2020 in Dhaka. At that time, Saif worked late nights driving a ride-sharing car. Night rides usually paid better, and the roads were less crowded. Most nights were routine. Pick up a passenger, drop them off, move to the next ride. But one night, something happened that he still cannot explain. It was around 2:15 a.m. Saif had just dropped off his last passenger near an almost empty road in the outskirts of the city. He was about to turn off the app and head home when a new ride request appeared. The pickup location was only 2 minutes away. Since it was so close, Saif accepted the ride. When he reached the pickup point, he noticed something strange. The street was completely empty. There were no shops open, no houses with lights on, no one waiting outside. Just an old bus stop beside the road. Saif checked the app again. The pickup location was exactly where he was parked. Then suddenly, the back door of his car opened. Saif quickly turned around. A young woman had entered the car. He hadn't even seen her approach. She quietly closed the door and sat in the back seat. Saif felt slightly surprised, but he didn't question it. Many passengers prefer to stay silent during late-night rides. He started the trip. "Where are you going?" he asked politely. The woman gave him an address. It was about 15 minutes away. As Saif began driving, the city streets looked unusually empty. Streetlights flickered occasionally, and the road stretched ahead without any traffic. After a few minutes, Saif noticed something unusual in the rearview mirror. The woman in the back seat was sitting perfectly still. Not moving, not looking at her phone, just staring forward. Her face looked pale under the dim light. Saif tried to ignore the strange feeling and continued driving. Then suddenly, the temperature inside the car dropped. The windows slowly fogged up. Saif adjusted the air conditioner, but nothing changed. The air inside the car felt cold, unnaturally cold. A few minutes later, Saif glanced at the rearview mirror again. And what he saw made his heart skip a beat. The back seat looked empty. Completely empty. Saif quickly turned his head. The woman was still sitting there. But in the mirror, there was no reflection. Saif felt a chill run through his entire body. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Neither of them spoke for the next few minutes. Then the woman suddenly spoke. "Stop here." Saif looked outside. They had reached a quiet street with almost no houses. "This is the location," she said softly. Safe stopped the car. The woman opened the door and stepped out. But before closing the door, she leaned slightly toward the front seat and said one sentence. "Thank you for taking the last ride." Then she closed the door. Safe waited for her to walk away. But when he looked through the side mirror, there was no one there. The street behind his car was completely empty. Confused, Safe checked the ride-sharing app. The rides had already ended automatically. But something about the trip looked strange. The passenger name field was blank. No profile picture. No phone number. Just one word under trip details. Completed. The next morning, Safe told the story to another driver who had been working in that area for years. The older driver listened carefully. Then he said something unsettling. Several years earlier, a young woman had died in a road accident near that same bus stop. Some drivers believed that on certain nights, she still requests one last ride and disappears before reaching home. Safe never accepted another ride from that location again. Because sometimes, the last passenger of the night isn't always alive. The Night Shift at the Hospital Basement, a true horror story. This story was shared by a hospital security guard named Rashed. It happened in 2015 at a large government hospital in Bangladesh. Rashed worked the night shift. His duty started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. During the day, the hospital was always crowded. Doctors rushing through hallways, patients waiting in long lines, families sitting outside wards. But at night, the hospital felt completely different. The hallways became quiet. Most lights were dimmed, and the only sounds were distant footsteps and the occasional beeping of medical machines. Rashed's job required him to patrol different parts of the hospital every hour. One of those areas was the basement. The basement was used mainly for storage and equipment rooms. Very few people ever went there at night. Even the staff avoided it unless necessary. One night around 2 a.m., Rashed began his routine basement patrol. He walked down the long staircase holding his flashlight. The basement corridor was long and narrow, with several metal doors on both sides. Everything seemed normal, until he heard something. A faint sound, like a trolley wheel moving across the floor. Rash stopped walking. The sound came from the far end of the corridor. He slowly pointed his flashlight in that direction. At the end of the hallway, he saw a hospital stretcher. It was moving slowly, rolling by itself. There was no one pushing it. Rash blinked, thinking his eyes might be playing tricks on him. But the stretcher continued moving. Slowly, quietly, across the floor. Finally, it stopped in front of one of the storage rooms. Rash walked toward it carefully. When he reached the stretcher, he noticed something strange. There was a white sheet covering something on top of it. It looked exactly like how patients are covered when moved through hospital corridors. Rash felt uneasy, but he forced himself to lift the sheet slightly. There was nothing underneath. The stretcher was empty. Suddenly behind him, he heard a metal door slam. The loud sound echoed through the entire basement. Rash quickly turned around. One of the storage room doors had closed by itself. His heart started beating faster. He slowly walked toward the door. As he reached it, he noticed the handle moving slightly, as if someone inside was trying to open it. Rash pushed the door open. The room was empty. Boxes of old equipment were stacked against the walls. Nothing else. Just as he was about to step out of the room, he heard something behind him. Footsteps. Very slow footsteps. Walking across the basement floor, Rash stepped back into the corridor. The stretcher that had been in the middle of the hallway was gone. Completely gone. The corridor was empty again. The next morning, Rash told one of the senior nurses about what happened. She listened quietly. Then she said something that made him uncomfortable. Years ago, before the hospital was renovated, the basement had been used as a temporary morgue. Sometimes bodies were kept there overnight before being transferred. Several workers had reported strange incidents during night shifts. Moving stretchers, footsteps in empty hallways, and occasionally, the sound of trolley wheels rolling through the corridor, even when no one was there. After hearing this, Rash never went to the basement alone again. And even today, whenever he hears the distant sound of a stretcher wheel, he remembers that silent corridor beneath the hospital. Because some places never truly forget the people who passed through them. The security camera footage, a true horror story. This story was shared by a man named Armin. It happened in 2019 when he was working as a night supervisor in a shopping mall in Dhaka. The mall was large and modern. During the day, it was always crowded with shoppers, families, and office workers. But after closing time, the entire building became silent. Most of the lights were turned off. Only a few security lights remained on in the corridors. Armin's job was to monitor the CCTV cameras in the control room during the night shift. There were more than 60 cameras installed across the mall. Entrances, parking area, corridors, escalators, and even the rooftop. Most nights were quiet. He usually spent his time drinking tea and watching the camera screens, while the other security guards patrolled the building. One night around 1:40 a.m., Armin noticed something strange on one of the camera screens. Camera 27. It was located on the third-floor corridor near a clothing store. At first, everything looked normal. The corridor was empty. But suddenly, someone walked across the camera view. It was a woman. She was wearing a long black dress and walking slowly through the corridor. Armin immediately sat up in his chair. That was impossible. The mall had been closed for hours, and security guards had already checked every floor. He picked up the radio and asked one of the guards, "Is anyone on the third floor right now?" The guard replied, "No, sir, the floor is empty." Armin looked back at the monitor. The woman was still walking slowly down the corridor. Her movements were calm and steady, but something about her looked strange. She never looked toward the camera. Her head remained slightly tilted downward. Armin decided to check the footage again. He rewound the recording by a few minutes. The corridor appeared empty. Then suddenly, the woman appeared in the middle of the hallway, not walking into the frame, not entering from a door. She simply appeared, right there in the center of the corridor. Armin felt a chill run down his spine. He quickly switched to another camera angle. Camera 28, the corridor from the opposite side. But in that camera, the corridor was empty. No woman. Nothing. Armin checked the first camera again. Camera 27 still showed the woman walking slowly. But camera 28 showed nothing at all. Now Armin felt uneasy. He called 2 guards and asked them to check the third floor immediately. A few minutes later, the guards arrived at the corridor. Armin watched the live footage carefully. The guards walked across the hallway. But something was very strange. On camera 27, the guards seemed to walk directly past the woman, as if she wasn't there. They stopped and looked around. One guard spoke through the radio. "Sir, there's no one here." Armin stared at the screen. The woman was still there, standing behind the guards, slowly turning her head toward the camera. And for the first time, her face became visible. Her eyes looked dark, completely expressionless. Then the camera screen flickered, just for 1 second. And when the picture returned, the corridor was empty. The woman was gone. The next day, Armin reported the incident to the mall manager. At first, the manager dismissed it as a camera glitch. But when they reviewed the recording together, even he looked disturbed, because the footage clearly showed the woman appearing in the corridor, but only on one camera. Later that week, one of the older security guards shared a story. Years before the mall had been built, that land had once been the site of an old residential building. According to local rumors, a woman had died there under mysterious circumstances. Some workers who helped build the mall claimed they occasionally saw strange figures during the night shifts. After that night, Armin continued working at the mall. But there was one camera he avoided watching for too long. Camera 27. Because sometimes, even when the corridor looks empty, he feels like someone is still walking there.